I'd like to introduce now our guest speaker for this evening. Pádraig Ó Tuama is a poet and a theologian known to many of you already. He grew up in Cork, mostly in Carrigaline, where I live and from where I'm speaking to you at this very minute. After a nomadic decade in his 20s, Pádraig settled in Belfast, where he worked in peace and reconciliation projects since 2003. Leading Corramelia, that's Ireland's oldest reconciliation organisation, from 2014 until 2019. His poetry has been published and broadcasted widely, from RTE's Poem of the Week to BBC to NPR in the USA. Pádraig presents the hugely successful Poetry Unbound podcast, 4 million downloads in the last year, with the On Being Studios. Pádraig has a deep interest in how religion, violence, colonisation and art can be explored as a way of reimagining public life in Ireland. And we are so delighted that he agreed to be here with us this evening. And just before Pádraig begins, I'd like to remind you that if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Pádraig based on his talk, please do pop them into the chat box and I'll try to get together some of them later on for the Q&A. So now, Pádraig.
Gurmila Magat, Elaine, and hello everybody. Thank you very much for the lovely invitation and the honour for being with you tonight. I grew up mostly in Carrigaline. I was born in Blackrock, and then my parents moved to Carrigaline when I was 5. I remember at the age of 5, before we moved to Carrigaline, which is about, I don't know, what is it, 7 miles from Blackrock, I said to my parents, I don't want to get a Carrigaline accent. I had some cousins from Carrigaline and I did not approve of their accent. And so such are the small sectarianisms that we are all so familiar with. Anyway, I have mostly in the last 20 years been working in reconciliation work in the north of Ireland. Maybe rather than talking about reconciliation, sometimes it's more accurate to call it conflict reduction work. Sometimes that's more truthful to say, because I'm not sure I can ever say what reconciliation is, having worked in it for a long time. I suppose I worked in 3 particular areas of conflict reduction. The first of which is addressing political sectarianism as a result of British-Irish conflict over the last 700 years, and then particularly over the last 100 years since partition, addressing the ways within which those things turn up. I also spent a lot of time addressing homophobia and looking at ways within which a population of people in Belfast particularly, but not only Belfast, live with the daily threat of violence, and looking at how we can reduce the impact of that conflict. And then other times I addressed religious differences, sometimes between people who believe the same thing, but who nonetheless are committed to fighting with each other. Conflict has a deep interest for me, because conflict is often the source of art and the source of curiosity and the source of a certain kind of fun or even humor. And then it flips a switch and it goes into violence. And it's curious to me what conflict we can cope with and what we can't. And that isn't the same for a single person all throughout their life. Sometimes you might know that a certain joke that you'd find funny ordinarily, maybe the week after a grief, you just can't cope with. It's not funny to you anymore, or something happens to you. And so conflict opens up something really powerful for the human experience, and it is of great interest to all of us, I think. The question of diversity that I know is at the heart of so much initiatives of goodwill these days is really the latest version of the question of how should I live and how should we live? And every rendition of this question comes with a new face. Sometimes that's a traveller face, or a Protestant or a Catholic face, or somebody whose marriage you disapprove of, or whose gender you doubt, or whose practices of sexuality, as you are imagining it, is not what you think you approve, even though you are continuing to imagine it. And so the contemporary question of diversity is not new. It's actually really old for many reasons, because we have been asking the question of how should I relate to them for generations, whoever they are and whoever I am. You find this at the heart of so much religious text across so many religions. You find it in the heart of poetry. You find it in the heart of so much. And a thing that concerns me in contemporary discussion about how a population should live with itself is the question of, or the word integration. And that concerns me when I hear that being spoken, because integration looks like a standard, and standards have to be policed formally or informally. And I can well imagine a family of Muslims lately arrived might feel the desire to integrate, to be seen to be good neighbours, and to demonstrate integration. And that the locals on the street might all say, my God, aren't they a great family for integrating? Never stopping to ask themselves, the people who were born and bred Irish for countless generations, whether they themselves would pass the very standards that they're measuring their new Muslim neighbours by. Now, I'm all for people getting involved in the community or learning Irish or history or being part of the Gaelic sports, anything. But those are not requirements for feeling safe. And it is an incorrect thing to think that people have to pass this test before they feel safe. Because, I hated sports, Gaelic sports especially, growing up. And that never once threatened my Irishness. A sibling of mine hates the Irish language, hates talking about it, and that under no circumstances threatens his Irishness. And I know so many people who, when they come up north, they speak about a partitioned Ireland as if they have never opened a book of history and have never considered the British Empire through the lens of what Ireland being colonised looked like. But that doesn't, even though I might deeply disagree with them, even though I might think they need to open a history book and learn about the impact of colonisation in Ireland, that doesn't threaten their Irishness. And so I wouldn't put my siblings through a test of their Irishness. And so therefore I am concerned sometimes about ways within which we talk about what a person needs to do to prove something in order to therefore feel safe. That is not of any interest to me, and I actually think it reveals a certain kind of hostility. People are told they need to prove to fit in. They can sometimes be put under burdens of integration that those people who are putting the burdens upon them have never been put on under themselves. And those people who are self-appointed policing of the standards of integration have probably never had their own Irishness policed as to whether it fits or not. Somebody I know and love once told a story of a man from the Congo who was lazy. Maybe he was, great. And suddenly the person who was telling me this said this to me in a way that was a disparaging comment about people who come over here looking for jobs. I was like, I don't care if he's lazy. Sure, I've got cousins who are lazy. I've been lazy. I've got aunties who are lazy. Laziness does not remove the possibility of belonging somewhere. Laziness, the older you get, certainly, is a certain kind of skill. And I, as somebody who have often overworked in my life, have a lot of admiration for people who have perfected the art of what might be called laziness, because I also think that is a certain art of waiting, or being open, or observing, or taking in the time of day. We've all got stories of people, characters we might call them, who we love, who we would not consider their laziness to be something that would remove the possibility of their citizenship, or their right to citizenship, or their rightful place to live wherever they want to live. One of the things about a Three Faiths Forum, and I know that there are people here from more than the particular three faiths that are described in the Three Faiths Forum, but one of the things that comes across when you imagine a Three Faiths Forum is that even those who are falling under the jurisdictions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, that there are only three faiths within that, because within each person there is a world of questions. What does it mean to be here? What does it mean to be alive? What are some of the stories that my culture says about how to live? What does it mean to mourn after someone's died? What does it mean to celebrate? How do I mark rites of passage in a life? How do I relate to the festivals that punctuate the year? Where in my life has my devotion been closer or further away? How have I learned from the crises of my faith? How have I learned from the limits of my faith? How do I reconcile the way that the people in my faith who I like and the people in my faith who I don't like somehow all come under the same umbrella? And so within even one faith, there are many different faiths, many different things that hold us to a center. For some, they're held to the center because of a belief in God, even though they may not enjoy the practice. For some people, they are held to the center because they like the practice, even though they might be pretty agnostic about the certitude around God. There are individual shapes for what it looks like to be Christian, to be Muslim, to be Jewish, to be Hindu, to be Jain, to be Zoroastrian, to be Buddhist, to be atheist, to be agnostic, to be pagan in Ireland. And each of these individual shapes is filled with the wonder and the curiosity where the human experiment finds itself speaking about the human experiment together. And what interests me is, what does it look like for that to be safe? When I moved to Belfast in 2003, I moved to a street on the Falls Road, thinking I'll fit in here. I was going to be working in conflict resolution, and I knew that a lot of my time was going to be spent in a particular British Protestant loyalist area. And I thought, I think I'd prefer not to have to worry about my name, Pádraig Ó Tuama, being something that would cause me anxiety where I was living. You know, if somebody said to me, "Oh, what's your name?" as a neighbour, I didn't want to have to think about, will I feel safe? So I moved to a particular street on the Falls Road. And I thought, because I share a lot of politics and language with what's assumed about here, I'll fit in. It's an Irish nationalist area where I moved. I'm an Irish nationalist. It's an Irish speaking area sometimes. I'm an Irish speaker. But it's safe to say that the 6 years that I lived in that street were filled with the most extraordinary kind of intimidation, the most phenomenal sense of displacement that I've ever lived with in my life. And there are 100 reasons as to why. And this evening isn't the evening to look at the 100 reasons. One of them, without a doubt, because it was told to me, was because it was known that I was gay, and that difference, despite all the other similarities of politics and religion and language, that difference meant that a neighbourhood tolerated awful things towards me. And I couldn't afford to leave, and I didn't want to be bullied out anyway. One of the things that troubles me is that when we look around and imagine, well, I'll fit in with them because of these 5 things, that doesn't always work. Because the opposite of that might be true. You might say, I won't fit in with them, or even more powerfully, they won't fit in with us because of these 2 things, these 1 thing, these 20 things. That doesn't have to be true either. The assumptions about how we live and work and are with each other are things that we need to see as worthy of being troubled. The question for me about all the Irishness in Cork or in the north or in the border area where I'm living now or in Dublin, the question for me is one of safety. What does it look like for a person to be safe in a community? Being safe, I think, means being allowed to think, being allowed to say, being allowed to make up your own mind. It means that you can challenge yourself in the way you wish to. It means having all kinds of choices. And if I wish to be safe, I suppose an invitation from that is to hope that I can also commit to the safety of others. And then I'm not only the host, because my family has been here for years, but I'm also the guest. And this, I think, is an invitation for thinking about what it means to be in an Ireland like we have now. Because it can be easy to talk about the host community and the new community. But one of the things that is important, excuse me, not COVID, just a sneeze. I can see all these people mouthing bless you or Gesundheit or all kinds of versions of that. What a lovely, generous gesture. Thank you. One of the things that is of interest to me is how we can pay attention to the question of power. And if I am the host, well, then that means people are coming to my house, my rules, my set of standards, my way of doing things. And so often the idea is, how can we welcome the stranger? But that still places the welcomer in a position of power and host. And that is not good enough. We know that from our history as white Irish people. We know that well. It is ingrained in our history as white Irish people about the experience of having been host and having been guest and all of the heavens and hells that are in between those 2 things. In the Christian tradition, there's a story that's central to the Gospels. It's a story about Jesus, and I'm going to share the text of it actually. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And he, meaning Jesus, said to him, meaning the lawyer, "What's written in the law? What do you read there?" He, the lawyer, answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he, meaning Jesus, said to him, "You've given the right answer. Do this and you'll live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan," and a Samaritan was somebody who was not Jewish. Samaritans are similar to Jews, but not the same. A Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I'll repay you whatever more you spend." Which of these 3, do you think, was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He, meaning the lawyer, said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." This is a fascinating text for all kinds of reasons. I think the most clear and I think a really beautiful interpretation of this text is, be like the Samaritan. Jews and Samaritans were close enough but far enough from each other that there was deep tension between them. They had different ideas about political borders as well as religious practice. And it's clear that one of the main interpretations of this text is, be like the guy who was good to the fella, even if it meant that you had to break a rule or 2 of your own, a rule about purity or something to help somebody. Okay, be like that person. And I think that is the most obvious and the most beautiful interpretation. But I would like to say that there are some other ways of asking this too. Because I think one of the things at the heart of this text is not only who will I help, but from whom will I accept help? What would it do to me to accept help from somebody I think it would be awkward to be touched by or awkward to receive help by? Would I want to tell a good story about somebody about whom I've usually been telling bad stories? What does it do for me in terms of my connection with people who I think are like me, when actually it's not them who have helped me? This is an example of turning the idea of the question of being host and being guest on its head. Because it's easy to think, well, go off you now and be like a good Samaritan and be amazing to everybody. But it can be often much more difficult to receive help when that help is complicated to receive rather than to give it. Because even if you're the only one who knows that you've given help, well, then you feel good about yourself. But it can be really awkward to know how to sit with yourself when you've been helped by somebody who you might not have wanted help from. Their touch can hurt. Earlier on, this text was introduced by a lawyer saying to Jesus, "How can I get eternal life?" And in a way, it's a silly question because I don't think he's concerned with eternal life at all. And Jesus tricks him into answering his own trick question by saying, "Well, you know the law. Tell me what you're supposed to do." And the guy says it. And then Jesus goes, "Congratulations. Well done. Nice answer." And then we get the brilliance of the text because it says the man was anxious to justify himself. And I think so many of the questions about white Christian Irish people are about justifying ourselves. And that's why I'm sometimes cautious about diversity, because diversity doesn't necessarily question the power at the center. And this man wants to justify himself. And so he asks, "Who is my neighbor?" And that, in a certain sense, is another way of saying, who am I allowed to hate? And that is a deep problem, because often we may wish to know, look, I'll be good to this cohort of people, but I'd rather hate that cohort of people over there. And this man is told, go and reimagine what it means for you to belong to your community, where you are not the center of everything, Go and think about a time when your safety has been taken away. Who would you want to help you lead you? Who would you want to lead you into safety? This is an extraordinary text. And one of the reasons I love it is because it's an argument within Judaism. Jesus is Jewish and the lawyer is Jewish. And it's two Jews talking about how to interpret the law. And Jesus' answer is to interpret the law in the way that it shows up in your life right in front of you. And that there it is, perhaps, that you might find God. A, in the experience of sharing help, but B, in the experience of receiving help. And that displaces a certain sense of power. Ireland has known an enormous amount about what it's like to face discrimination in your own country and criminality. There's been the systemic process of just decimating the Irish language, the systemic process of making a country dependent on a crop that then went through a blight and was destroyed. And then there was the manipulation of the food that was being produced into a way that caused a famine that was utterly unnecessary. There's been the manipulation of working and rural classes, and there's been laws designed to impede the capacity for neighbours to show solidarity to neighbours. Then there's been partition and criminal levels of gerrymandering and ways within which the main thing that Ireland was exporting was not Kerrygold butter, but our own people. And along the way, we've built up a reputation for ourselves about being good crack and being fun. And I like those stories, and I think they're often true, but not true enough. Because sometimes when I hear the way white Irish people like me talk about people who've moved here, for whatever reason they've moved here, you'd swear to God that this country had never known a bit of hunger, had never known immigration, had never known what it was like to recognize that out of the 7 children in your family, most likely all 7 of them would have to go across a sea in order to get a job in the future. You'd swear we'd never understood what it was like to say to someone we loved, "Are your neighbours nice? What's your boss like? What are the people like to you?" There's an extraordinarily convenient forgetting of the past in the way that racism and intolerance shows up in Irish society. I want to finish with some really challenging words from Frederick Douglass, who was an American emancipationist, a black man himself. He had unshackled himself from the criminal shackles of enslavement that had been foisted upon him. In 1845, at the start of the famine, he paid a visit to Ireland and he experienced welcome from white people such as like he'd never had before. This is what he said. This is a direct quote from what he said, because he gave some speeches. "I can truly say I have spent some of the happiest moments in my life since landing in this country. I seem to have undergone a transformation. I live a new life. The entire absence of everything that looked like prejudice against me on account of the colour of my skin contrasted so strongly with my long and bitter experience in the United States that I looked with wonder and amazement on the transition." That quote's being used a lot these days. People are loving it, saying, "My God, isn't it great that Frederick Douglass had a lovely time when he came to Ireland." But here's what this quote leaves out, is that Frederick Douglass went back to America, and during the years of 1845 onwards, hundreds of thousands of hungry, colonized Irish people fled to the shores of America, hundreds of thousands of them. 8 years later, Frederick Douglass had something very, very different to say about Irish people. This is what he said in 1853. "The Irish, who at home readily sympathize with the oppressed everywhere, are instantly taught when they step upon our soil to hate and despise the Negro. They are taught to believe that he eats the bread that belongs to them. Sir, the Irish American will find out his mistake one day. He will find out that in assuming our avocation, he has also assumed our degradation." The question for me is not a privileged people of power in the middle deciding how it is that we tolerate new communities, because I think that is unfair to new communities. I'm delighted anybody wants to move to Ireland. It's thrilling to be in an Ireland where people want to move here for whatever reason they wish to move here. I am thrilled. Ireland has done this for 200 years, and I think lots of the world has enjoyed much of the Irish culture that's spread, and I am thrilled with all of the different experiences of religion and faith and race in Ireland now. But I am not the police about how people should feel safe. The question for me is how we look at ourselves as white Irish people who, like me, there is no history in my family whatsoever of anybody outside of Ireland being in the family until this current generation. Absolutely no. Even the Irish people who went to England married other Irish people. And so there has been an extraordinarily similarity there. And in the context of that, I think it's really important to recognize the power that I have in that way. And I am not the police as to who should feel safe here. The answer to that is everybody. And that is a complicated response, because safety and love rhyme with each other. And safety and love are shown in how we treat a neighbour, but also how we write policy, also how we decide questions to do with fair employment, also to decide the ways within which we mediate discrimination, also to be done in the ways within which we make sure that the faces of Ireland that are being presented are representative rather than prejudiced. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Father. That was, well, I'm glad it's recorded, because I'll definitely want to listen to all of that again. We actually haven't had any questions. Everybody's been so enraptured listening to what you were saying. So we haven't had any questions. So I'm just going to, I just jotted down a couple of things, if you wouldn't mind exploring them a little bit further for us. I was very interested in what you said at the beginning, actually, when you talked about that art, that conflict and art is kind of almost the same thing, not the same thing. I'm putting this wrong. How would I, conflict as a source of art? Can you unpack that, to use that word, unpack it a little bit more? You were saying until the switch flicks, and I do understand what you mean there, but just a little bit more about perhaps how conflict fuels your art as a poet even.
Yeah. Well, I suppose poetry is necessary for me when I notice things that are in contrast to each other. The idea that peace looks like nothing going wrong whatsoever, I think, is quite a bland imagination. Peace is shown in the capacity to have an argument, but without recourse to threat, where I can deeply disagree with you, vote differently, absolutely disagree with somebody on the basis of how they understand God or religion or society. Great, but that we don't recourse to threat in that, and that there's the idea of safety present while we disagree, perhaps even fundamentally. It's possible to be peaceful there. And one of the things that happens between me and a person is just an echo about what happens between me and me. I'm in conflict with myself, and I need poetry in order to begin to listen to some of the voices in myself that might be speaking to me. And every other artist that I've spoken to, musicians and painters and dancers, all speak about what is it like to live with this energy of having questions you'll never get the answer to, not being entirely sure about how to understand what it means to be human, that is a fundamental chaos and conflict of being human. And it is from there that art comes. I am not interested in solving conflict around the world. I am interested in diminishing violent conflict and threatening conflict and unsafe conflict. And those are two very different categories of conflict for me.
Feel that kind of conflict per se is just a part of the human condition. Totally. And it's how we handle it.
Yeah, I mean, listen to a baby. I mean, if you're ever, if friends of yours, I mean, I'm sure plenty of you have had babies, plenty of them, and grandbabies too. I'm from a big family. There's loads of grandchildren. Listen to the rage in a child. My God, it's unbelievable. And it's extraordinary what a child does. I'm talking like a 2-month-old when they want milk. And they let you know the profundity of their conflict. Nobody has taught them anything, but they are communicating something powerful. And within the context of that, hunger is always going to be true. And the experience of hunger is something that I want to put art around, and policies and safety and culture, not war and not discrimination.
I often thought when my children were little and they showed that rage, they hadn't learned how to be polite yet. They could just, no shadow side at all, kind of.
But sometimes when you see a baby like that, Elaine, don't you sometimes have a small pang of envy to think?
Oh, totally envy, absolutely. They don't care whether you love them or not. They're going to get what they want. They're survival machines. Totally. That's the way it has had to be, I suppose. I was just going to ask you, I think we're okay for time for another couple of minutes. I was going to ask you about, I had been pushing your book beforehand.
Oh, thanks.
It's a wonderful, wonderful book. Tony Murphy, who's on the call as well, bought it for me as a present last week, and I have absolutely loved it. And
Thanks.
I highly recommend it to anybody who wants to really good read. And I was just wondering whether you can talk maybe just for a couple of minutes about this whole loving kindness, transcending the law.
Yeah. Well, so this book, Borders and Belonging, is an examination of Brexit that I, in a book form, co-written with Glenn Jordan, an examination of Brexit through the Book of Ruth, which you find in the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish scriptures. And the Book of Ruth is a story about Moabite, another near neighbor, where there was tension with those neighbors coming. And the question at the heart of the Book of Ruth is not, will we be nice to her? Will we give her pity? The question that she holds in herself is, how will you interpret your own laws? Will you interpret your own laws to kind of cut off your nose to spite your face? Or will you interpret your own laws through the lens of chesed, loving kindness? And what she is saying, and what really the inclusion of this extraordinary text in the Hebrew Bible says, is that the way to interpret the law is through chesed, through loving kindness, and that there shouldn't be the possibility of interpreting the law where you're doing so in a level of threat or violence. And that, I mean, Augustine echoed this hundreds of years later. You should never move on from a text unless you've been able to read the text through the lens of love. And I find that so many faiths don't say, here's how to interpret everything in our faith, but they will say the primary level of interpretation must be the level of something called chesed, something called loving kindness, something that is demonstrated in action. And often we're caught between the idea of our religion and then the reality of the person in front of us saying, will you provide for my safety? Or can I provide for yours? And those things can seem to be in conflict, but that's an old story. And so there's great comfort really in recognizing the oldness of that story. And that's what I love about the inclusion of this book in the Jewish Bible, is that this book is saying, here is the template for how to interpret Torah, the law. Here is that. And that, I mean, Jesus came along later on and says that, the law must be interpreted through love. But he wasn't saying anything new. He wasn't the first Jew to say that. He was just demonstrating how Jewish he was to say that. And that is something that I think that many Christians who read those texts choose to forget.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm just checking the chat box and everybody is saying how wonderful everything is, but no other questions. So at this stage, I would like to thank you so much.
My pleasure.
For being here tonight and helping us to open our minds to different way of thinking. And we could have gone on a couple of hours, of course, but on behalf of the Cork Three Faiths Forum, my heartfelt thanks. You are absolutely inspiring. So thank you so much.